I'm really honored to be here, and I'm very honored to be here with Alysia. We thought that we would begin by just each reading just a little bit of our memoirs so that you could get a taste of the subject matter and the voice of the memoir, and then we would have our conversation. So I'm gonna begin. My book, as Julie said, which has an ant crawling on it, is called The Suicide Index, and it's a book about my father died in 1991, and I'm just going to read the beginning. The first chapter is called Suicide Act of Attempt to Imagine. In the airport, coming home from vacation, he stops at a kiosk and buys grapefruits, which he arranges to have sent to his daughters. They will stumble over the crates waiting on their porches when they get home from his funeral. It's the last week of his life. Does he know that? At some point, yes. At the moment when his index finger closes on the trigger of the gun, he knows it with certainty. But before that, even a moment before, when he sat down in the chair holding the gun, was he sure? Perhaps he's done this much before, once or many times, held the gun, loaded the gun, but then stopped himself. No. When does he know that this time he will not stop? What about the gun? Has it been an itch, a temptation, the hidden chocolates in the bureau drawer? Did he think about it daily? Did it draw him? Did he have to resist it? Perhaps the thought of it has been comforting. Well, remember, I can always do that. Or maybe he didn't think about the gun and how it might be used. There was just that long, deep misery, an occasional flicker, I want to stop everything, always instantly snuffed out. Too difficult. How would I do it? Even the question exhausts me. And then one day the flicker caught fire, burned brightly for a moment, just long enough to see by. Oh yes, the gun, the old gun on the closet shelf with the sweaters. He didn't do it that day. He put away the thought. He didn't even take the gun down, look at it, hold it in his hands. That would imply he was thinking of actually doing it, and he would never actually do such a thing. Some days the gun sings to him. Other days, more often, he doesn't hear it. Maybe on those stronger days, he has considered getting rid of it. Take it to a gun shop, turn it into the police. But then someone else would know he has a gun, and it's no one else's business. He hasn't wanted to deal with their questions. Where did you get it? How long have you had it? Besides, how long has he had it? 20 years, 25, and never fired it in all that time? So where's the danger? What's the harm in keeping it around, letting it sleep there among the sweaters? He doesn't even know where the bullets are, for God's sake. But immediately, involuntarily, he does know. He knows exactly which corner of which drawer. We have to watch him from the outside. He leaves no clues. His whole life is a clue. What is he thinking when he gets up that last morning, showers, and dresses for work? He puts on a blue and white striped cotton shirt, a pair of brown corduroys, heavy brown shoes, a tan cashmere sweater. He has joked to his daughter that all the clothes he buys these days are the color of sawdust. Might as well be, he said. They end up covered in the stuff anyhow, in the machinery business. So he has shaved, patted on aftershave, and climbed into his dun-colored clothes. He's gone to his dresser and loaded his pockets. Change, wallet, keys, handkerchief. Maybe he thinks he's going to work. Or maybe he knows, hopes, that in 45 minutes he'll be dead. It's Friday morning. He's just doing what he does every morning, getting ready. He may be thinking about it on the walk down the long driveway to get the newspaper. The cold, dry air gripping the sides of his head, the ice cracking under his feet as he tramps along this driveway he can no longer quite afford. Is there something in the newspaper? The front page is the only one in question, since he leaves the paper on the kitchen table folded and unread. More bombings. All this week he's been sitting in front of the television in the evenings, staring at the news. Silent films of Baghdad buildings, fine white-lined crosses, zigzagging dizzily over their facades, zooming in and centering. Then a long moment, just that white cross holding steady. And then the building falls down. No sound, no smoke or flash of light, just caves in. And that's it. The screen goes blank. The camera doesn't wait around to gloat. Then another building, another filmed implosion. We're getting all these places, relentlessly. We're hunting them down and getting them. What has he been thinking about this week, watching these films over and over? The silent buildings that simply implode. The front page of the paper is full of the war, but nothing else that's major. No market crash, nothing that would lead, directly or indirectly, to his losing more than he has already lost, which is virtually everything. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's what he is thinking, not just on this last morning, but all the time. You've lost everything, not at a single blow, but gradually, over years, a small hole in a sandbag. You see the hole clearly, but you have no way to fix it. No one but you has been aware of that thin, sawdust-colored stream of sand escaping. But now enough sand has leaked that the shape of the bag is changing. It's collapsing. It will be noticed. You will be caught. And then, you don't know what. You want not to be here when that happens. He makes the pot of regular coffee for his wife, fills a cup, carries it upstairs to her bedside table. The fact that he doesn't make his own usual pot of decaf might mean that he's already decided. Or it might mean that he generally makes that second pot when he comes downstairs again. And this morning, he doesn't go downstairs again. He stands at his wife's side of the bed and looks at her, sleeping. He looks at her for a long time. Or maybe he doesn't look. Maybe he puts down the saucer and goes for the gun and is out of the room before the coffee stops quivering in the cup.
Thank you. I'm also honored to read with Joan tonight. And we'll read just a short excerpt from early in the memoir, Fairyland. When I remember Dad now, I mostly remember his innocence, his sweetness, his gentle manner. He wasn't tough. None of the tragedy he'd known. Losing his wife in a car accident, feeling rejected by family and lovers. None of this had hardened him in any way that I could tell. His hands were soft. He had pale skin and freckles. He burned easily in the sun, so he generally avoided it. As a little girl home from the first grade and resigned to cozying up to the television for company as my dad worked on his poems and cartoons, I developed a crush on Mr. Rogers. He was so like my dad, with his slender shoulders, brown hair, and light eyes, the careful way he removed his loafers and laced his sneakers, his gentle manner of speaking and inviting you into his life. Every day he sang me a song, and every day I answered him, "Yes, I will be your neighbor." You could hear Nebraska whenever my father opened his mouth. His conversations were peppered with folksy sayings and examples of the dry wit he'd admired in his grandma folk. Widowed young and never remarried, she cared for 2 children on a school teacher's salary and helped raise my father until my grandfather returned from the Second World War. "If you burn yourself," she used to tell him, "you gotta sit on the blister." I used to tease him, the way he pronounced cafe, the way he called the remote control the clicker, or the way he called every pasta dish we ate spaghetti, instead of differentiating between linguine, fettuccine, and angel hair, as I had learned to do, a San Francisco sophisticate. When he said okie dokie and smiled his toothy grin, it sounded old-fashioned and silly. Sometimes his more literary friends would make fun of him. They laughed when at a fancy dinner, Dad told them a story about his childhood dog, Sparky. But the quirkiness of his speech, as much as I teased him for it, just made him more of the dad I loved. Dad's sweetness and easy manner charmed people and animals alike. Whenever we were at a party or at someone's house for dinner, whatever cat was around would inevitably end up on Dad's lap, purring away while he stroked its fur absent-mindedly. At many of these parties, I was the cat, always drawn to his lap, always calmed by his breathing, his vibrating chest and soft voice. And on his lap, he would also pet me with those gentle, loving hands. I have pictures of him at age 8. His parents used to drive him and his younger sister from Lincoln to Denver every summer. In Estes Park, you could feed chipmunks with peanuts sold by the bag at the park entrance. In one picture, he's crouched perfectly still, his hand balanced on a boulder, his fingers outstretched, clasping a peanut. And at the end of that peanut, a tiny chipmunk nibbles away while my father looks content and serene. In the background, his younger sister Elaine is in bangs and pigtails, her mouth open, mid-complaint. No matter how much she tried to tempt the chipmunks with her swaying peanut, they were always drawn to Dad. As a child, I loved looking at pictures of my father's boyhood in Lincoln. There he is riding a bicycle. There he is playing Pony Express and circus with the neighborhood kids. The scenes of my father captured so diligently by Grandpa Abbott looked to me right out of the shows that aired every afternoon on TV. Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best. Grandpa scribbled titles on the photo backs too. Dancing Steve, First Communion, Taking Time Out for Refreshments. These titles unwittingly masked quiet unhappiness I only understood after reading my dad's journals. When some people age, you can see a history of disappointment in their face and posture. A smile is creased in the corner as though it painfully swallowed an unpleasant truth. Sad eyes slant and sag. Cheeks grow pale. Shoulders slump as if weary from carrying the burden of grief, guilt, or an unresolved hurt. But look at a photo of the same person as a child, and you may see someone else entirely, someone full of lightness and joy and that peculiar, almost stupid hope that can only come from inexperience. My grandmother, Munka, she talked about that stupid hope. It was maybe for this reason she avoided looking at herself, pictures of herself when she was young. I once asked about her wedding portrait, which we didn't find until after she died. I don't know where it is, she said. I think I saw it once and thought, that stupid girl, she doesn't know what she's in for. My father also didn't know what he was in for as a grown-up, but that stupid hope came later. And pictures of him as an adult in San Francisco with his arms slung around the neck of a young boyfriend, or pulling me onto his lap in a cluttered apartment kitchen. He looks relaxed, almost giddy. Posed among a group of illustrious writers in the basement of City Lights bookstore, he appears content and proud. Standing on Haight Street in his beard, fedora, and 1940s top coat, he looks in his element, like a king surveying his lands, unaware of the invaders at the gate. You find a different Steve in the Nebraska pictures. As a 3-year-old, he already looks uncertain. As a child of 7, he's often looking away from the camera, while his sister will be smiling and looking straight on. In another photograph, a close-up of him in an Indian headdress leaning against a tree, he sneers. In his eyes, there's an aggressive snarl that seems deeper than the typical pretend play of children. In pictures with his parents, I rarely see affection. His body is stiff next to his mother in a parking lot somewhere in Colorado. Both of them are looking away as though trying to find their real families. In the family album, I see, in fact, that no one in my father's family hugs. They rarely touch. Hands are in laps or at sides, clenched into loose fists. My father never officially came out to his parents. Helen and Jean Abbott learned their son was gay by reading a letter Dad had written to his brother David, which had been left out on the table, but they'd long been suspicious. Dad wasn't able to be himself, his true self, his naked and profane self, until he left Lincoln for Atlanta and then San Francisco. And once he came out, he was fully out. He could never go back in. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're just going to continue tonight. We are both recently read each other's work and are very excited to finally have an opportunity to ask each other questions. In fact, at one point, Joan and I were emailing saying, should we get on the phone and talk about, what we're going to say? And Joan rightly said, no, I know we're dying to talk about all these things. Let's keep it fresh. Let's not say anything until so we both are kind of bursting. But I could just start with something. One thing that's really interesting to me that you may not know is that Joan's father and my father actually died just within a year of each other. Her father died in February 1991, and my father died in December 1992. And my father died in California, and her father died in Connecticut. And and while my father died at the end of a long illness, he died of AIDS. Her father's death was sudden, but both of the ways our parents died, our dads died, were sort of deaths that had a larger meaning and significance. And I just wanted to ask, because you write really eloquently about the sort of transformation that the manner of your father's death would change for people, that the stigma around suicide would impact, how you're able to talk about him. And as well as just suicide, you beautifully talk about suicide as one of the few ways you can die that it's a noun in addition to a verb. You can commit suicide, but you are a suicide. Whereas if you're murdered, you're not a murder. The manner of death is a definition. And so I just wondered if you might comment on maybe the desire you had to fight against this determinism of the word.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And it's interesting too, because I thought about this when I was reading your book, that both of us, I think for both of us, our father's deaths, it's a personal, terrible experience, but they both had a larger context in a way. I think I was drawn to write about my father, partly as a personal thing and partly because I'm a writer and that's how writers operate. Something happens and you write about it. But I think I was also really interested in the nature of suicide. And reading your book, I felt that you were really writing about a community and a time and a place, as well as writing a personal book about your father. So I'd like to ask you that question too.
Sure.
But what I feel about suicide that was really hard is I felt that immediately after my father died, the way people spoke about him changed. It was sort of like suddenly he was this guy who had done this thing, and it was hard because I remembered him as my wonderful, gentle, lovely, funny father, and it was like this clump thing came down on him that was suicide. He was a suicide. And I think part of my desire in writing the book was to restore some of him to his personhood, although I didn't have the kind of archives that you had with your father, the journals and the letters and all of that. I think there's a way that my father is much more of a mystery to me still. But I also felt that there was something about suicide that gets directly in between the person and your memory of the person. And to contrast with that, I could say, that when my mother died after a long illness, I was very sad and I missed her and I had grief, but it felt like it was kind of straightforward grief because I knew exactly who it was that I was missing. It was my mother, and the manner of her death did not interfere with my sense of who she was. And I think there's a way with suicide that I was struggling with. The world suddenly thought this thing about my father, and I didn't want to think this thing about my father, but it did change, my sense of who he was, because I suddenly realized he was very secretive. He hid his depression. He didn't get, had no diagnosis, no treatment. And I think he it threw into question all my memories of him. And I think there's a way that that's part of what I'm writing about in the book, about the nature of this kind of suicide that comes with no warning. That I think one reason I think the grief goes on for so long and never really can resolve itself is that you can't think of that person for a really long time without thinking of the manner of his death. And I think that the reason the book ended up being a memoir rather than a novel, for years I was working on it as a novel, but I think it ended up as a memoir because I think the suicide really interfered with memory, and that was the place that I had to work through it as a memoir.
And in your memoir, you do such a beautiful job too, sort of taking these contradictions. Even in the part you read, you said he leaves no clue. His whole life is a clue, and that kind of at once, the fact that you thought you knew him, you didn't know him at all, and what didn't you know?
Yeah. But then I'm curious with your father, because he left a lot of clues. I mean, he left writings and letters, poems. One of the things that struck me is that your book is not only a memoir, but it's also really an artistic biography of your father and of his work. And I'm curious what it was like for you to remember him doing those things when you were a child, but then also going back as an adult and as a writer to revisit his work.
I think thank you. I mean, I think that's sort of is sort of the shifting of lenses from, and something you write about as well, from being a daughter and having these personal memories and these, understanding someone through the prism of that relationship versus being a biographer and trying to see them in the larger context of, in my father's case, I was trying to look at him in a historical context for, gay men of his generation and the sort of migration of men that were coming to San Francisco and what sort of forces they were leaving behind, and as well as his cultural context and his literary influences in his circle. And what was really interesting is, of course, my father died of AIDS when I was 21, and during his lifetime, I was always aware of his writing, but his writing really played the role of competitor for his attentions. And so I had sometimes a hostile relationship with his writing, where I just said, I don't want you to go out tonight, I want you to stay home. Or I think I even, wrote him a letter, a sort of short story when I was 10 about how he was suddenly so successful that there was a presidential campaign and they were reading his poem, but he decided that nothing was so important as his daughter and he left it all behind. And it was just like, and I called the title was Sudden Success. But he never had, that was the other thing that was sort of interesting is, in a very strange way, in his lifetime, because he published in small presses and small circles, through the publication of my memoir, I was actually able to get him a much larger audience for his writing than he ever knew in his life, which felt to me like a gift I could sort of give to him posthumously, to have his work translated into French, for example, which culture was very meaningful to him. But it was interesting to have to, you think someone, you're like, oh, this is my father, I know him so well, I've read his letters, this is, I've watched him die, there's no more of an intimacy than that, yet to revisit that life, 20 years later, and then from this perspective of what was he working on actually, and what was he thinking, and what were his friendships like, and his relationships beyond, the father-daughter relationship, it was, that was a whole new experience. And I wonder, I thought what was, what's sort of challenging when you are sort of trying to be both a biographer and a memoirist is the struggle to sort of get it right, to sort of produce a portrait that would feel true somehow and real, and as you are engaging in that, that it's basically impossible to some extent. There's no way you could create someone as full as you know them, and so you're sort of working against this attempt. But two, I think, is the challenge, and I think you handled it really beautifully, of the different relationships that define that person. And so in my instance with my dad, I was an only child, and my mother died when I was 2.5. And there wasn't, at the point of his death, there wasn't a significant lover in his life. There were some friends, but I approached this book feeling like, this is my story to tell. I have no one else's version to sort of, work against me. That and as well, I think I felt this sort of birthright, like I was left these journals. He knew that this was the reward I got for losing him was the ability to tell his story the way I wanted to. Like I sort of took it that way. And how challenging for you that would have been to be writing this at the time of, with your sister having her own version of events and your mother having her own version of events. And how do you tell the story and try to reach some truth or while accommodating those other points of view? And there is this beautiful part, I'll just to quote it was just really interesting, where you'll say, I know my mother is dying to tell this part of the story, so let her tell it. And then you'll suddenly quote her. Mm-hmm. So I feel like you were making these accommodations.
Yeah, although I'm not actually quoting her, I'm sort of fictionalizing, I'm really fictionalizing my version of what I think her version is, So but it's very interesting, Alysia, that, this is such a classic question of memoirists. When I'm teaching nonfiction, this is everybody, there's this moment where the room gets really quiet and then someone goes, how do you write a memoir without hurting anyone? And, the answer is, do you really, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I think memoirs always feel dangerous if they're done right. I mean, I think your case is very unusual where there aren't people to be hurt. But I think it's tricky because you have to, if you're writing about a situation that's a mess, you have to actually let it be a mess on the page. You can't clean it up so much that you're being untrue to the experience. But at the same time, you don't want to put every piece of dirty laundry on the page because that is gratuitously, it's gratuitously mean, first of all, to the people around you. And second, frankly, even if I look at it just coldly as a reader and writer, I have read memoirs sometimes where I just feel like there's too much, they're working out a grievance on the page. And I think there's a way that the stance of the narrative is very important, and I think it's interesting. I mean, I'll ask you this too, how you get the stance right is very tricky. I know that with the Suicide Index, I overwrote initially. There was a lot of stuff in there that I was angry about and got into a draft, and then as I went through successive drafts, this book took 11 years to write. As I went through successive drafts, I took some things out because I just realized it made me feel much better to write them, but nobody else needed to read them, and they were not necessary to the story. So I think that is tricky, but I did also have that birthright feeling. I felt that there's a way that my father's death was a major cataclysm, and I just felt like I had a right to tell the story. But I had to go very gently among my family afterward, and it took, some people were more upset about it than others. Some people chose not to read it, which I think is fine. I think that's actually a wise response sometimes, just to say, I'm sorry, I can't read this. And I didn't tell anyone that I was working on it while I was working on it. But one thing I'm dying to ask you about with narrative stance, because I thought when I was reading your book, I loved the way you got on the page yourself as a little kid, yourself as a teenager being grumpy often with your father, and I took the grumpiness as part of the love, that it was just, what I love is there's such a close relationship on the page in your book. I really feel like you and your father are not always pleasant to each other, but you're always in there. Like it just feels so real and so engaged, both the way he was toward you and the way you were toward him. And I marveled that you were able to get on the page yourself as a kid and as a teenager, and this kind of more compassionate perspective of yourself now. So I thought it was remarkable that you were able to write about your young self in the voice of your grown-up self, and I was totally in there with the young self, but also I appreciated the tempering and the perspective of the older self. And I wondered whether it took you a while to get to figure out the voice of the book.
Well, you said that it took you 11 years to write your book. I feel like in some ways I started thinking about writing my book in the immediate years after my father died, and did take some stabs. I mean, I sold the book on proposal and probably produced the final product in about 2 years, but I actually feel like I'd been writing it for 20 years in some ways. In that I tried to approach the story in essay form, and often as I worked toward telling this story, one of the comments I would receive back from readers or potential agents were like, "You're not seeing yourself as a character here," and that's was such a very difficult concept for me to get early in my writing life, because I was like, see myself as a character. This is a memoir. I'm writing in the first person. This is me. I am me. It's like, no, you are. You need to have enough distance to see yourself as a character amongst other characters that's going through changes over time. And for a very long time, I was so defined myself, I think, or worse, through this tragedy or through this loss, feeling like I was this grieving daughter, and that was still a big part of who I felt myself to be, and that grief was sort of ongoing, and I need to get on the other side of that to see myself as a character in the round, and to be able to see myself at these different stages of my life, interacting with my dad, which in some ways I feel I was really grateful that I did not actually start writing this book in earnest until many years later, because by the time I finally wrote the book, I was a parent myself with a young daughter, and even just working on the book and having the young daughter pop in and try to talk to me while I was writing give me a lot of compassion for what my father had been through, and it really helped me to see him again, not just in terms as a child might or a young adolescent might, because he died when I was still I was only 21. I was still sort of an adolescent. In a way, our relationship had kind of stalled at this level. And it wasn't really until writing the book that I could try to see him almost as a peer, the way as a grown-up you might reapproach a relationship with your parents and say, "I'm so sorry. I kept you up all those nights worrying. I know now how hard that was." I think it takes years of maturity and experience to be able to come to that. So that was something that I could only achieve, over a great distance of time. One of the things I really admired in your book was your structure and kind of how you found that structure. And I'll just return to what you were saying earlier about this being a mystery, and he left without a clue. His whole life was a clue, and this kind of desire to even that you in that first section you read of, he might have been thinking this or he might have been thinking this, and sort of examining all of these points. And it's almost like a maze, the way you're in a large maze and you go on a false direction, then you stop. Okay, it's not there, and you have to go back several steps and go to the beginning, you go take another channel. I felt like your book, it was sort of an unmemoir, a very untraditional memoir in its structure. It's a suicide index, and it's indexed. And that allows you to sort of reflect that experience, to replicate that fragmentary experience. I just wonder how you finally seized or found that form.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm a big believer when I'm writing in finding, I didn't know this until I wrote that book, but that finding the right form, that every story has a form that's the right form for that story. And sometimes you find it right away, and sometimes it takes a really long time to find it. But once I find it, it just unlocks the whole story. And so I think with my father's death, I initially thought, I had been a fiction writer. I'd written a novel, and so I just assumed I was going to write a novel about a family where the father kills himself and what the impact is on the family. And I tried and tried and tried and tried, and it just didn't work. And I think part of why it didn't work was I was trying it in a very conventional novelish way, where everybody would have a kind of dawning understanding as the book went along. And the problem was I didn't have a dawning understanding. I had a continual muddle, where I would sort of understand one thing, but then something else would happen. and I would suddenly not understand what was happening, and we would find, I'd find a new box in the closet that told me something different from what I already knew, or I would just, there wasn't a straightforward progression, and so I just couldn't figure out how to do it as fiction, or how to, every time I tried to fictionalize an event, it read as baloney. I didn't believe it on the page. And I think it was because I had so much at stake, I just couldn't do it. Which doesn't mean that someone else couldn't do it. Someone else could write someone else who had a family suicide could write a beautiful book of fiction about that. But I couldn't.
But I would say that your coming at this as a fiction writer brought so much truth, in the sense that what Joan does that's really remarkable for Memoir is her perspective changes at different points in the book, where she'll write about herself in the third person. She'll write in the second person addressing her father. She moves these perspectives in different ways that are surprising, that are oftentimes using speculative imagination, which it doesn't compromise the category of memoir. But it feels really like, I feel that your knowledge and confidence within fiction allowed you to take these steps that just gave it such a vividness.
Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah,
but I do think there was a way that I think you're right. I think I was playing with fictional techniques writing memoir, and I think it worked for Suicide because it's such a, you can't ever have a definitive version, of a person or of this thing. And so I think, and you had asked about the index, that actually came very late in the process. I had been working on the book for about 10 years, and I tried to make it a continuous narrative, and then as you pointed out, the nature of the experience was so chaotic and fragmentary that I had to find some kind of, I just decided to throw out this linear manuscript and write in fragments. Mm-hmm. And once I started writing in fragments, then I felt like I was getting each bit, but I didn't know how to put it together in a way that a reader would feel like, what I think about is the National Gallery in Washington. When you walk through that museum, there's sort of this central corridor, and all the galleries are off the corridor. So you always know exactly where you are in the museum, even as you're making your way through it. And I think I intuitively knew that this book needed something like that. I didn't know what it was. But I think when I stumbled on the index, which seemed also like a kind of ridiculously, ironically orderly way of trying to, there is no way to put this event in order, so let's just plop an index on top of it. And I think there's a way that was intuitively right. But I needed an organizing principle because it was such a chaotic event.
I know. I kind of wish. I feel like we should be reading some of these titles that you have in the. So it would be like suicide, anger about suicide, speculative possible reason for. It'd be just, but like this, everything sort of in terms of suicide and how it impacted, everyone around and all the different. I mean, it's hard to. And then you'd even have some chapters would just be like 2 words. I feel like there was one, maybe you could remember what it was.
Yeah,
it was suicide, years it took not to feel numb, many years. That was it. That was the chapter, or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, again, it was, and I don't know if you felt this too, but one of the things that's really weird about, when you're writing about a difficult experience, there is a kind of, there's a relief when you're telling the story in the right way for that story. And I wondered if it felt that way to you too, that people say to me, oh, it must have been so hard to write that book. And it was hard because I couldn't get it right. Mm-hmm. But there was a sort of feeling of such relief when I felt like I was writing it and it felt true to me. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you had that.
Well, I definitely had a shift in terms of how I approached the story, as I said, from earlier in my life to when I finally did sell the book. And part of that was seeing that this event, this experience I'd had, the loss through this disease, was not something that just happened to me. And it was something I always knew in theory, like, yes, many people died of AIDS. AIDS broke up many relationships and families. This is a horrible crisis that touched many people in our society. But I'd never, I think I was just for a long time focused on my personal experience. And once I could see that I could maybe tell a story of a larger community, even just a little bit, even just the community of people that my father knew in San Francisco, and I might be able to look up their obituaries and talk with their friends and lovers. And I mean, it just, in a way, it helped relieve me, because I think that's something that can be really difficult in memoir and approaching memoir, is this feeling that the tension is always on you, and to say, well, it's actually about something that's bigger than me. I'm not just talking about me. I'm not just writing about me, but there's an idea here, and there's a larger story I want to tell and I want to get right. And that can involve research that's beyond my personal experience. And once I discovered that, I thought it really helped. Everything started flowing from there. And I think too, also just going back to what we were saying before about stigma, at the time that I was writing the book and first started writing the book, our society had changed so much since 1992 when my father died, in the sense that, suddenly gay marriage was being talked about and voted on. It's something that would never have been conceived of in 1992. The It Gets Better campaign was started by Dan Savage. There just was a general interest and awareness of like, these are stories that are important that we need to think about. But there was still, in my view at that time, very little knowledge of queer history, LGBTQ history, in the wider mainstream society. And I had felt that maybe that I could, and partly this, even the history of the AIDS crisis, there was so much stigma around AIDS and those that lived through it. And then as a society, that there was kind of a little bit of discomfort around talking about it. And I felt that as a result of that culture, I felt there was sort of an erasure of that history. And for me personally, I felt like that a little isolated in a way in my grief, that there was something that people didn't talk about or really acknowledge. And it's changed actually a lot since I worked on the book. Just in the last 5 years, we've had A Normal Heart, the Larry Kramer movie on HBO, and we've had How to Survive a Plague, and we've had the Dallas Buyers Club. I mean, there's actually a lot that's just been coming out in the last few years. But for me, I felt like I wanted to kind of study and explore that community as a way of fighting against that sense of erasure that I felt like was tied to the stigma.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I admired that about the book, that I learned a lot reading your book. But I also felt that you did a beautiful job of writing about a time and a place without doing that sort of thing that people can do sometimes when they're writing about a history, where every single incident that happens is relevant to do you know what I mean? That every remark that was made in the 60s has Kennedy in it, and every hat was a pillbox hat, and every, you know what I mean? And what I thought you did a really good job of is recreating what it's like to live through a time without realizing that you're living through a time. I thought, just even the way you talk, I mean, it's very poignant at toward the end of your book, how slowly it really dawned on you that your father had AIDS. And I thought you did a beautiful job of showing how he was trying to be very matter-of-fact with you about, the details of some of his symptoms and medical things that he was doing. He wasn't hiding any of that from you, but at the same time, the full force of it didn't really hit you. And I just wanted to say that one of the scenes that I thought was just beautiful and devastating was there's a scene, and I hope it's okay to just say it, that there was a scene where you were working in a restaurant in France, and you have to quit the job partly because you're going to go home and take care of your father, and there's this kind of cold boss, and you tell her that you're quitting, and you say that you're going to go home and take care of your father, which is true, but it's not going to happen as immediately as you make it sound like it's going to happen. And then that's when it breaks upon you that there's this terrible thing happening. And I just thought the way the grief comes out then, I thought you did a really good job of how unexpectedly those things hit us and how we can sort of live with them for a long time before we even really realize what's going on.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's funny because that reminds me, you're just saying about it breaking, and in your book, one of the big themes was your own numbness, and to your father's death, and this way you would tell your husband, like, I think the ice is breaking, like that you had this feeling of being sort of stuck in ice, and that was something I really related to, because, and you even talked about, you had a chapter where you were talking about, again, it was sort of indexed as food eaten around, it was sort of all this food that you ate, that you were constantly, part of your grieving process was eating chocolate brownies that were undercooked and extra gooey. But that often all this eating would make you feel these sensations, and how you just wanted to feel sensations because it was so hard for you to feel. And and I just felt like I really related with that. And actually that was it was really an interesting point in the book. I felt like was a layer of suspense. It wasn't just like, well, why did your father do this, which was kind of unknowable and all these things, but like, when is she going to feel? When is she going to react to this? And when does the anger come in? Like, when does the sadness come in, and when does the anger come in? And I just feel like that's also something that we can relate with, in that, if someone, especially with these stigmatized diseases, there's a feeling sometimes that for a long time, those that died of AIDS it's like, well, this happened because of your behavior. There was sort of a view that somehow these people were responsible and brought it on themselves, when, they're responsible for us being human, in a way, and being susceptible to something that was wildly. Anyway, but and that similarly with suicide, it's like, well, this is who's at fault here? Is it the family that couldn't reach or understand that this person was suffering, or was it this person who couldn't, who didn't fight back these feelings of depression, and this having to find the place between saying, what, this is an illness.
Yeah.
I felt angry at my dad for leaving me, and I felt angry at him for telling me when I was in the middle of college and not ready to hear it, you have to come home and take care of me because there's no one else, and here's how we're going to do it. I'm like, how dare you do that? And it took me actually longer to get to the point where I would say, I look back at myself with shock at like how selfish I was, or how unable at the time I was to be able to see just how hard it was even for him to have that conversation with me, how much strength that took. And for you, it seemed it was actually you for a long time were wanting to protect him and not be in touch with that anger.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I felt when my father died that way, that he had given himself the worst punishment possible. So how could I pile on top of that? And it is true that these are two illnesses that weren't treated. I think your father's AIDS happened before the medicine.
Yeah.
So it's that was something else that is very sad. I think to read about these men who, I don't know whether my father ever would have gone to see a psychiatrist or taken, modern antidepressants, and I don't know, he would have seen that as a sign of weakness, and that, I don't know whether anyone could have ever talked him out of that. But I do feel that he, whatever he had was untreated, and that, that's medicine is better now than it was when these things happened. But yeah. I don't know. One other question, maybe one last question I have for you is, do you think your father would have liked your book?
It's actually so funny that you say that, because as I was reading your book, and there's that part where you said something about you're almost having a conversation, you're looking at sort of the biographer, and the person who's being written about, having almost a conversation, saying, "Did I get it right?" And the person saying, "No, you didn't get it right. There's no possible way you could get it right." And I thought to myself, as I was reading this, people have asked me all the time in the past, like, "What do you think your father would say?" And I'm like, "Oh, he'd think it's great." And I'm like, "Of course he wouldn't." You know what I mean? Of course there would be ways that I would have failed to tell the whole story. My story is colored by my perception. I tried to do a good job by interviewing people and researching and using his journals to try to create a portrait that felt true to me, but also, complex and rich. But, I would have to think that, that he would have been happy for the time I put into it. Meaning, it's sort of strange, but in the process of writing the book, I felt like I got to spend time with him and be close with him, because I was studying his journals and reading them in a way I never had before. As a child, I would just scan them looking for my own name. It was so horrible. And now, it's seriously, but now I could, I was really trying to understand him and approach him with compassion, and I got to spend time with him, and even just recognizing, even in his journals, moments he was sad that he didn't share with me. And just sitting with him and spending that time. So I like to think that he would have been glad that I spent that time with him, that long visit, in a way.
And that's a hard thing, I think, about finishing these books, is you, in a way, it's, you've kind of restored the person by writing about him, but you lose him again when you finish it.
Mm-hmm. So that is hard.
Yeah.
So do you want to, shall we read the final reading?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll each read a little more, and then we'll just see if there are any questions.
Okay, that's perfect.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to read the epilogue. The first line of this says, "After my father died nearly 20 years ago." And as I'm reading that, I know this December it'll be 25 years. So I've got a big anniversary coming up. After my father died nearly 20 years ago, the lights in fairyland went dark. I left San Francisco for New York in the hope of rekindling the adult life I had to snuff out when Dad got sick. But the world I rejoined there was mostly young and straight. I could count on one finger the number of friends who'd even met my dad. At first, this was liberating. I could reinvent myself. I could be someone other than daughter. But I also felt this persistent sense of dislocation. With few people to share memories of my father, I had no outlet for my grief. I started to feel as if the life we'd shared existed only in my head. And in the pages of Dad's out-of-print books, his journals, and the letters I ritualistically reread on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death. This disconnect intensified after the introduction of protease inhibitors in the mid-90s changed AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable disease. Those who hadn't lived through the epidemic would come to know almost nothing of it as a cultural amnesia set in. The heavy warlike losses of the AIDS years were relegated to queer studies classrooms taught as gay history and not American history. All along, my memories of those years have followed me, along with my father's papers, from an apartment on the Lower East Side to a Brooklyn loft, and finally to the house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that I now share with my husband and 2 young children. All along, they spoke to me, and I to them, and in the course of that conversation, this book emerged, more by fits than starts. Finally now, nearly 20 years after I first sat down in that closet full of notebooks, the book is written. But something happened along the way. Researching Dad's life, I've made contact with his old colleagues and friends and others we knew. People like Joyce Jenkins from Poetry Flash, and Jimmy Siegel, who owns Distractions, and Sean, the smiling Southerner who worked at Coffee, Tea, and Spice in The Haight. Speaking with them, I got to hear 3 powerful words. 3 words I didn't know I so badly needed to hear. I remember you. With these words, the lights switch on, the music plays, the carousel starts up, and those glittery and colorful horses move up and down again, delighting my every sense, For a moment, I get to be a child again, and I feel wholly me. Working late one night with my kids and husband, peacefully sleeping upstairs, I decided for the first time to research the BAR obituary database. The BAR, or Bay Area Reporter, where Dad sometimes covered books and arts, was an important barometer of the AIDS epidemic, the papers dramatically thickening as the numbers of dead increased. Those obituaries are now online, thanks to the GLBT Historical Society, part of a database searchable by name or year. Sitting in my dark home alone, I easily found the obituaries of friends, like Robert, a devout Wagnerian, Tommy, Teddy and Cuddles were by his bedside, Jono, an incredible kisser, a perfect listener, and Sam, goodbye, my mystery. Then I searched out names from Dad's journals, men I didn't know but who were among his friends. Then I just started browsing, randomly clicking on names, reading stories, and staring at picture after picture of the dead. All of these Peter Pans, young men frozen in their 80s haircuts and sweaters, never to realize the potential of that first book of poetry, that well-received play or generous heart. His friends were his life. And soon I was sobbing until my eyes were puffy like a boxer's. I felt battered with grief. How strange, I thought, when the crying finally subsided. I'm not gay. I'm not a member of this generation of men that lost so many friends that whole phone books had to be tossed. This grief, I now realize, has always been with me. I just never located it. This place where Dad and I lived together, our fairyland, wasn't make-believe, but a real place with real people, and I was there. And though I haven't lived in San Francisco since 1994, and though the life I live is very different from the life that I shared with my dad, one he might even consider bourgeois, I am very much a product of his world. Though I am straight and haven't had a living gay parent for almost 20 years, I still feel a part of this queer community. This queer history is my queer history. This queer history is our queer history.
I'm just going to read a little section from a chapter that comes kind of late in the book. The first half of my book is really about the factors, my father and the factors that led up to his death. And then the hardest part to write was the impact of his death on me and on our family. So I'm just going to read a little section from a chapter that's called Suicide, Psychological Impact of. And this section is called He Appears in the Airport. I checked in for my Paris flight at Logan and sat in a chair drinking tea and doing a crossword puzzle. I got stuck on a clue and looked around the room. My father was sitting across the lounge at the end of a long row of chairs. He was wearing a suede jacket, reading the Times, waiting patiently for his flight to be called. It was different from the other times when I'd spotted him, in the cheese shop, or sitting a few rows ahead of me at a concert, or climbing slowly out of a parked car as I went by, helplessly, in the passenger seat of a moving one. This time, I knew it wasn't him. I was like a veteran of the desert who knows about mirages, but can still be stirred by one, capable of simultaneously discounting and savoring the sight of green trees and a pool of clear water. I sat in the departure lounge looking wistfully over at this guy. Not only did I see him, I understood him. He was living a peripatetic life, flying to and from Europe, where he could travel easily, comfortable in the German of his childhood and the French, Spanish, and Portuguese he spoke so fluently. He was living this other secret life because he was afraid to come home. I knew I wasn't going to get up and move closer, but I imagined what might happen if I did. I imagined that he would have looked up to stare at me with uncertain, smiling amazement. His cover would have been blown, but we would both have been relieved that I'd blown it. I would have said to him, "It's okay. You don't have to worry anymore. It's safe. The mess you left has all been cleaned up. You can come home now."
So Josh was saying that he recently found out that approximately 11% of the population in Provincetown, so there's 3,000 permanent residents, 300 of them are living with AIDS. And so with that knowledge, do I feel sort of a special connection to being here. And actually it's funny that you mentioned that, because I came in with my family last night, and today my daughter and I went to the Provincetown Library so that we could both do some reading, and it's such a beautiful library. And immediately when we came in, she saw this station that had a video playing and some handsets. You could listen to the video, and the video is about the AIDS years in Provincetown from 83 to 93. It's a documentary. She just went up and started watching it. And I said, did you want to go read? She said, I'll be right, I'll meet you up there. And just knowing that she was going to sit down and watch this documentary, which was something that, I've taken this deep interest in this history and in these documentaries, but I know very much that Provincetown is a very, I didn't get to see this documentary myself, but I asked her, I said, what did you think about it? She said, well, it wasn't. I said, was it very sad? She said, it wasn't. It was actually very empowering. Because she was talking about just how the residents in Provincetown came together to care for its own, and this remarkable, just how that worked. And it felt like a real gift to me that she could just stumble onto this, because I didn't know that this documentary was going to be playing in the library when we went. And she knows her grandfather died of AIDS, but I had an unusual childhood in that, because my dad shared a lot with me from a very young age. And in some ways, I felt like I couldn't always be a kid because of that situation. I was also, because there was just the two of us, there was a lot of I was his confidant with his bad boyfriend problems and everything. And so so with regard to some of this history, my view with Annabelle is I've really wanted to have her curiosity lead the conversation. I'm not going to say, listen, we're going to sit down and talk about this. I'm going to tell you if you ask, and then I'll show you things, and I'm open about it, but I don't, I want you to just be able to play and not worry about it if you don't have to. Just to not have to, this is a question actually I'd wanted to pose to Joan, was sort of the level, the next generation. You experience this as a daughter, but then you also experience this as a mother. How do you explain this history to your child in a way, and wanting to protect them or not? But so anyway, all this to say is I do feel I want to go watch that documentary myself tomorrow at the library, but I'm very aware of this being a final place that a lot of men came to be with their chosen families, and that was on the map. This is a really important place, and so it feels important to me.
Yeah, the question is what are the insights that you gain after going through something like a father's suicide, and how do they help you live with the people around you? Do you mean in terms of recognizing depression in other people, or?
Yeah, so more specifically about that too,
yeah.
Although I'm more asking about, because one of the central questions you raise in the book is, how did I really know this person?
Yeah.
So as you then look at the people around you after that experience, does that question resonate with you then?
Yeah, I think there's a way that the second part of the question was that does it then make you feel that you don't really know the people around you? And I would say that's actually a very perceptive question that I wasn't actually as quick to realize that as I was. But I think I do have a feeling sometimes that I'm standing on the floor, but there could be a trap door. And so as a result, I have some other relationships which ended abruptly, and it's always a really hard thing if you've been through a suicide, because I think there is a way that, first of all, an abrupt ending of any relationship is painful, but also that feeling of, oh my God, did I know that person? And you know, it's interesting. I've seen that with friends of mine also that have been through this. That does seem to be an effect of it. That you know, I certainly have relationships that I trust and people that I know. So it doesn't make it. It's not like it's tainted, you know, all my relationships. But I think there's a way that when something ends in a way that doesn't seem natural, it completely freaks me out. And I think there is a way that the other effect that I think it had on me is I was a very, very wise 25-year-old, and then this happened when I was in my early 30s, and I became a lot less wise. And I think, thank goodness, you know, because that was sort of, I think I had an idea that there was an explanation for everything, and that we could just analyze it and figure it out, and I think there's a way that, you know, when something really bad happens, it knocks down a lot of your certainties about the world, and I think in a way we could do with a lot fewer certainties. That question was how do we all understand our parents? I don't know, but you know, I thought what Alysia said was so interesting, because I've sensed this in your book. One of the things that I think is fascinating is that as you get older, you catch up with your parents. So I feel like when my mother was 40 and I was, you know, whatever I was when she was 45 and I was 15, I didn't understand her at all. But I feel like by the time I got to be 45, I understood a lot of the way she was with me when I was 15. You know, so I think that it's an interesting thing about writers, because often when I'm reading a biography or a memoir, I realize that part of what I'm seeing is the writer catch up with his or her subject in time. And I think it is true that that's maybe it. But the sad thing is it's too late for the parent. I mean, my mother said to me before she died, one day you're going to, you know, a lot of that stuff. And I sort of feel like I just keep saying, like, you're right, you know? Are you happy now? You were right.
Should I try to answer too? You know, my father was my only parent when he died when I was 21, and so you know, and I didn't know my mother at all, but you know, I would often have friends who were having fights with their parents, or they would sometimes they'd break off. They'd be like, I haven't talked to my dad in 6 months. I'm like, what's wrong with you? How could you? You know, I would often feel like this sort of jealousy, like how can you just have that relationship and not want to keep it, you know, going? But I kind of realized that I had an unusual situation, that I could sort of, as being the writer and the survivor, is a power. You know, it's at once a power and a responsibility to be the one telling the story. But it's sort of like going through all of his affects and kind of trying to make sense of it and have this, you know, access to it. I think, you know, I guess if you don't have access to that, you could try to, you know, talk to your parents and ask them these questions. But I think maybe what's really unusual, maybe that from this experience is sort of exiting all the dynamics of the parent-child, which is sort of you get stuck back into your child role, but trying to write them and see them as a whole character and yourself as a whole character, which basically is to see them with compassion, you know, with the flaws and all. The way there were moments even in your story, Joan, where you would be writing about your mother, and then as beautiful transparency as a writer, you would say, I'm wondering if I should soften that tone and give her a little bit more sympathy right here, so you would understand what she was going for, you know, or what she was going through. Like, I think as writers, we're trying to show our characters, but with an understanding of what's motivating them. When you're in a relationship, you don't take the time to, you're so focused on your point of view, you can't forgive them and understand and excuse them. So maybe that would be a takeaway.
Yeah.
Anyway. So the question posed is, how much intimate contact have we each had with dying people, and how that's shaped our work, I guess our worldview maybe a little too. You know, it's, I felt I have not. I've was with my grandparents, my one grandfather as he was dying, and then 2 other grandparents I saw soon before they died. But I think only that one grandfather and then my father were people who I had been with at the moment of death. And it did feel to me like an extremely intimate experience and powerful experience. I think this is actually, in a way, writing about it has in some ways created distance from it. And I'll say this in this way, that I've had some friends who've lost parents in more recent years, and one of them, her father died of cancer, and she talked to me and she said, tell me you went through this, how did you go through this, tell me what this was like for you. And I had this moment of realization where I was trying to remember, and rather than remembering the actual experience, I was remembering the written version of my experience. And I felt a loss about that. And sometimes I feel like I've wanted to have parts of my life not be written about so that all the emotion would still be there, like they'd be tucked away in like a hidden recess. Because in the process of editing and writing, the words kind of can replace the memory. And I've even had, it sounds terrible to say, but sometimes I've had friends who are going more recently through a death, like I will envy them their sensation, like the intensity of that feeling, because I feel like if it's harder for me to remember that intense feeling, I feel like it feels like a loss on top of the loss.
Yeah, I've had that same thing. To answer your question, I don't have that as much intimate experience with death. I mean, my father's death was violent, and that was, unnatural. And with my mother, I was with her during the week that she was dying, but I wasn't. No one was in the room with her when she died. But I definitely have experienced what Alysia is talking about like somehow you think that in writing you're getting close to something, and you are. You have to get very close to it in the act of writing, but then having written it, it's like it's on a shelf. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes I'll be startled by some real stab of feeling about my father, and I'm grateful for it. I mean, it's painful, but I'm grateful for it because I just feel like, oh, it's still alive. It's still.
And that messiness, like that raw emotion, kind of unfiltered in a way. Yeah,
and the surprise. I think that's the thing. Part of what I think makes you so sad after someone dies is the surprise. You can't get used to this new reality, and so these things, like that feeling of. After my father died, there was a book that I had borrowed from him, and I came upon it one day in the bookshelf, and I thought, oh, I need to return this. And then, and that's the kind of thing that, I know that's not quite what you were asking about, but I do think what you're asking about is true, that there is a way that the terror that we all have of death is divisive in a way, and to somehow be less afraid and to be there. That was one thing that I thought was very powerful in your book. The question was, talking to the next generation about these things, and I can sort of say that one of the dilemmas that I had with my father with suicide was that I did not want my sons to grow up with family secrets. So I didn't want to not tell them, because I felt like I didn't want there to be this big secret that they found out one day. But the other issue was that neither of them has ever seemed particularly curious or interested. And so it's sort of weird, because I didn't want to shove knowledge on them that they don't want, but on the other hand, I don't want to hide from them things. So what I basically did with them is I have a scene in my book of telling my older son, and it was very, awkward, and I don't really know if there's a right way to do it, but it just sort of felt like I needed to tell him so that it wouldn't be unspeakable. I needed to speak about it so it wouldn't be unspeakable, but I also didn't want to force anything on him that he didn't want to know. And it's funny, because both of them have remained pretty uncurious about it. Mm-hmm. I think they may have dipped into my book. I think maybe read the book. I don't know. I wouldn't ask them. But it's hard. My father was a really secretive man, and my children are very private people. I don't think they're secretive in that way. I don't feel there's a sense of danger, but I do think it's a challenge to know. I was a very curious kid, and I was always prying and trying to find out what the deal was with my parents. And in a way, I think my mother would have loved a reserved child, which she didn't have. But I have 2 reserved children, and I think I have to kind of respect it. I don't think I should blab too much, but I just want them to know there's nothing that's off limits.
It was one of the things that was interesting, because I've had this recollectors project that was mentioned at the beginning, where I am working with a friend of mine who lost her dad the same year to AIDS, and it's a sort of network where we collect stories and share and interview people who have gone through this, and this idea of stigma is, we have had some people who were told lies about how their parents died, and one woman only found out recently because of a medical question, and she examined, she looked into his medical history and found out that it was that he'd actually died of AIDS and not stomach cancer. And there was also someone else who still hadn't told her partner, her husband, how her parent had died, and so there are some people for whom this truth, the stigma within certain communities around AIDS is so great that they would not say anything at all. This wasn't the case for me. I think because there was some secrecy in my family and other generations, I was just one of those people who was always rifling through drawers and looking at photo albums and boxes and journals, and I would sit down and I would ask I think I got a video camera when I was 23, and I sat down with my dad's parents and I started filming. I said, "So when did you find out my dad was gay?" I just, without any, I was like, "Tell me all about it," and they were just horrified. It was so difficult for them. So I think, I just there's just a lot of, for me, just it's just open. I don't see, I think that it's just important to be as open as possible, and in fact, I like to think that, my daughter, just knowing that her dad was, her granddad was gay, sort of gives her a curiosity and knowledge about that history and community and a sense of connection that I've felt, and when she wants to, as she grows up, she'll just, it makes me proud that she can feel open about this too. That so much of stigma is continued because of secrecy, and if you're open and you're like, oh, this is totally normal, that helps break it down.
Yeah, and I think that's true about suicide too. I mean, I know there's a debate about suicide, talking about it versus not talking. I mean, there's sort of, there's stigma, which is bad, but then there also are different kind of philosophical feelings about whether or not too much discussion of suicide does, we don't want to glamorize it, we don't want to whatever. But I think that not talking about it at all is dangerous. Yeah. And Alysia, it's so sad, it's so interesting what you said. I mean, that's making me realize, I have this in my book, people who don't know how their relatives died, or who know that there's a suicide, but then sort of forget. My husband had a friend in high school whose mother died this way, and then when my father died, 15 years later, he called up his friend and said, "I want to talk to you because your mother died this way." And the guy said, "I don't know what you're talking about. My mother didn't die that way." So I think people do it. It's almost, you use the word erasure before. I think there are people erase things that are too painful, and that's, one thing about writing is I think it's the opposite.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.